It began on a night made of gold and arrogance. Crystal chandeliers poured light onto velvet tables, the air heavy with the scent of wine, money, and laughter that didn't care who it wounded. In the corner of a glittering restaurant, a man in a navy suit laughed so loudly that it silenced the entire room. His watch gleamed like a symbol of time that only the powerful could afford to waste. Around him sat people who nodded when he laughed, smiled when he sneered, and lived in orbit around his ego. And then there was her, standing before him, a tray trembling slightly in her hands. A young black waitress whose eyes carried the fatigue of double shifts and the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive invisible. She didn't belong to this world of crystal and cruelty, but tonight, fate had decided she would stand right in its center. The billionaire's laughter carved through the silence again. He held up a sheet of paper, covered in equations, circles, and symbols. Things that didn't belong in a place like this. His grin was wide, performative, the kind of grin that meant to turn a human moment into a spectacle. Around him, the diners leaned closer, eager for entertainment. The scent of mockery filled the air more strongly than the perfume. She stood still, her expression unreadable, but inside, she felt the same cold heat that burns when dignity is cornered. There was no anger yet, just the familiar ache of being underestimated. Again. For years, she had learned how to disappear. To smile at insults disguised as jokes. To hold back the truth of her intelligence because no one wanted brilliance from a waitress. But that night, under the soft glow of chandeliers and the weight of his arrogance, something inside her stirred. Something long asleep. The laughter around her felt distant now, like echoes through water. All she could hear was her heartbeat, slow, steady, defiant. Each thump whispered reminders of who she had been before the world clipped her wings. The girl who once stayed up nights solving problems that even her teachers couldn't. The girl who believed equations had beauty. The girl who had to trade numbers for napkins when life ran out of mercy. The paper in his hand fluttered slightly as he waved it toward her. The crowd's amusement thickened. Cameras from expensive phones glinted in the dim light. To them, this was just another cruel game between power and silence. But something changed when the paper reached her hands. Her fingers, roughened by dishwater and long hours, brushed against the ink. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the ghost of the life she lost. Symbols she used to know, logic she used to love, dreams she used to chase before the world told her she wasn't meant for them. The room blurred around her. The billionaire's grin, the audience's laughter, even the clinking of glasses, it all faded beneath the hum of recognition. Somewhere deep inside, an old rhythm awakened. The language of numbers, the melody of problem-solving, the thrill of knowing she could. But this wasn't a fair challenge. It wasn't about the math. It was about humiliation. He didn't expect her to solve anything. He expected her to fold, to smile awkwardly, to laugh along with her own degradation. That was the unspoken script. That was how it was supposed to go. Yet as she looked at that paper, her silence transformed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It became the silence of focus. The billionaire mistook it for hesitation, but it was something far more dangerous. Awakening. In that instant, the power in the room shifted ever so slightly, though no one noticed. Not yet. The laughter still rolled, but the story had already begun to rewrite itself. Her eyes lifted slowly, not to meet his, but to look beyond him, past his wealth, past his arrogance, past every ceiling that had tried to hold her down. The air grew heavier. The laughter shorter. The arrogance louder, as if trying to drown out the quiet storm forming in her chest. Because for the first time, she wasn't just a waitress. She was the test he didn't mean to take. And the answer he would never forget. No one in that restaurant knew it yet. But the world was about to witness something extraordinary. The collision of cruelty and brilliance, prejudice and perseverance, ignorance and intelligence. One act of arrogance would ignite a chain reaction that money couldn't control. One woman's silence would soon speak louder than an empire's applause. This wasn't just a story about a billionaire's ego or a waitress's patience. It was about something far deeper, the moment when humiliation becomes fuel, when injustice becomes a spark, and when a quiet soul decides that enough is enough. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin without words, just a trembling hand, a forgotten dream, and a single piece of paper, waiting to be solved. Morning light in her world never glowed like it did in theirs. It didn't filter through grand windows or dance across marble floors. It squeezed through thin curtains in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of coffee, detergent, and quiet resilience. The city outside was loud, but inside everything was still, except her. Always moving, always trying. The woman who would later silence a billionaire began every day in motion before the sun did. The world woke slowly. She didn't have that luxury. Her alarm clock was the faint cry of her daughter in the next room. Her heartbeat quickening as she moved through a ritual that wasn't glamorous but sacred. Packing a small lunch, combing her child's hair, whispering silent prayers that the day would be kind. She'd once believed that kindness was something you earned. Then she learned it's something the world gives selectively. Years ago, she had worn a cap and gown, her smile wide, her future open. Numbers had always made sense to her. They were pure, not corrupted by color or class or gender. Numbers didn't judge who was solving them, but people did. Scholarships came and went, each one with promises that dissolved under the weight of real life. When her mother got sick, tuition became medicine. When her daughter was born, textbooks turned into grocery lists. Dreams had to eat too, and hers starved quietly. Now she worked at a restaurant that gleamed with wealth so loud it almost drowned out her own worth. Every shift was a performance. Smiles rehearsed, apologies scripted, posture perfect. In this place, she wasn't a person. She was service. Her name forgotten, her stories invisible. Yet she saw everything. The sneers, the dismissive eyes, the subtle pauses that said, "You don't belong here." But she also saw patterns. In behavior, in tone, in who got respect and who didn't. She was a mathematician of human cruelty, calculating each act of condescension with precision. She could predict who would snap their fingers for her, who would ignore her thank you, who would look through her as if she were air. Still, she endured. Because beyond the uniform and exhaustion, she was building something, quietly, stubbornly. Every night after her daughter fell asleep, she opened an old notebook, edges worn and pages yellowed. Inside were remnants of another life, equations, unfinished theories, fragments of brilliance she once owned. She didn't open it to remember what she lost. She opened it to remind herself she was still capable of more than the world allowed her to be. Her co-workers sometimes asked why she never got angry when the rich treated them poorly. They didn't understand that anger, when fed too long, burns from the inside. She had learned to turn her fire into focus, into silence so still it unsettled those who looked too closely. The restaurant wasn't just her workplace. It was a theater of inequality, every night the same script. The wealthy dined as if the world was theirs to consume. The staff floated like ghosts, serving luxury they could never afford. But ghosts see everything the living pretend not to. Among the regulars was one man who stood out, the billionaire whose name filled magazines and whose smile filled screens. To the world, he was the embodiment of success, self-made, brilliant, charming. To those who served him, he was something else entirely. He came often, his entourage always changing, but his attitude never did. He treated kindness as a transaction, respect as a currency that only flowed upward. He enjoyed testing people, making them squirm, turning decency into a game. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about proving he still had it. For months, she'd observed him from the sidelines. The way waiters forced laughter at his jokes, the way he tipped just enough to feel generous but never enough to feel genuine. He was a storm of arrogance wrapped in designer fabric. And she, the quiet one, was invisible to him. Until the night that changed everything. That night began like any other. The restaurant buzzed with expensive laughter, every table reserved by people who measured worth in dollars and applause. She floated between them, balancing plates. collecting empty glasses, smiling through exhaustion. But there was something different about her that evening, something small, invisible to others but real. Before leaving home, she had slipped her old notebook into her bag. She didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe the universe was preparing her. The night was unusually crowded. The billionaire sat at the center table, surrounded by executives and admirers. He was in one of his moods, the kind that turned ordinary moments into performances of dominance. Each time he spoke, others leaned in as if listening to wisdom, not arrogance. She approached their table carefully. It was routine: take orders, refill glasses, maintain composure. But as she leaned forward, she caught sight of the paper beside him, covered in equations, graphs, and symbols. It was strange to see such things in a place built for vanity, not intellect. He was bragging about his latest investment in artificial intelligence, how he could solve problems faster than most scientists. The table laughed, feeding his ego. That's when he noticed her, the only one not laughing. He studied her like a curiosity, eyes narrowing in a mix of intrigue and condescension. A waitress with eyes that didn't lower. That was unusual. To him, it was amusing. To her, it was dangerous, but she didn't flinch. Something about the paper drew her gaze, the equations, familiar and haunting. She could see the errors even from a glance. It wasn't arrogance that made her notice. It was instinct, the same instinct that had once made her brilliant. He noticed her glance and the air changed. The others at the table followed his eyes. In an instant, she was no longer invisible. The billionaire smiled, the kind of smile that makes the air feel heavier, the kind that says, let's make a spectacle out of her. And just like that, the moment was set. The trap disguised as a game, the arrogance dressed as humor, the cruelty camouflaged as a test. Every injustice she had ever faced began to hum in her bones. Every time she'd been overlooked, dismissed, doubted. They all led here. When the paper left his hand and landed in hers, the world tilted. Chandeliers shimmered above her head, their light almost blinding. The crowd leaned in. She could hear her own breath, feel the weight of every eye. She didn't know it yet, but the universe had written this moment long before the night began. A meeting between arrogance and humility, ignorance and brilliance. And she was about to remind the world that brilliance doesn't need a title, a suit, or a seat at the table. It just needs a moment to be seen, because beneath the laughter, beneath the wealth, beneath the glass and gold, truth was waiting, patient, quiet, unstoppable. And it had finally found its voice. The paper in her hand felt heavier than its weight, as if it carried not just ink and equations, but centuries of arrogance pressed into its surface. The billionaire leaned back, his laughter rippling through the air, confident that he had turned her into the night's entertainment. Around him, guests smirked into their wine glasses, waiting for the predictable scene. A nervous waitress fumbling with something far beyond her reach, but that wasn't what they were about to witness. She stood still for a moment, long enough for silence to feel like defiance. The edges of the paper trembled between her fingers, but her eyes were steady. Beneath her calm exterior, something ancient was waking. The voice of a woman who had once solved the impossible while the world told her she couldn't. The equations on the paper weren't random. They were elegant, intricate, the kind that revealed a person's mind by how they approached them. She recognized patterns immediately. Derivatives, vectors, statistical models. It wasn't gibberish. It was a challenge, a cruel, calculated one. He had written it knowing it would look intimidating to anyone outside academia, and especially to someone he assumed had no place touching it. He wanted laughter. He wanted proof that she was beneath the room's brilliance. What he didn't realize was that brilliance was standing right in front of him. The numbers began to whisper to her. Soft, familiar, like an old language she hadn't spoken in years. Her mind, dulled by fatigue and routine, began to ignite. Every neuron remembered what it meant to think freely, to chase beauty in logic, to see order in chaos. The crowd's amusement grew impatient. They thought her silence meant surrender. But inside, she was building something. Time began to stretch, seconds into minutes. Around her, waiters passed. Laughter resumed, but she remained frozen in that bubble of clarity. The world blurred, replaced by the clean lines of thought that only mathematics could provide. She took a breath, deep, grounding, powerful. The same kind of breath she used to take before exams, before defending proofs, before believing she could change her life with reason alone. She didn't have a pen, but that didn't matter. Her mind didn't need paper to move. The first step appeared in her imagination. She saw the equations not as symbols but as stories, stories she knew how to end. The patterns unraveled, revealing what he couldn't see, the errors he had made. He wasn't the genius he claimed to be. His test wasn't perfect. And that realization gave her quiet strength. Every laugh that escaped his lips became fuel. Every smirk at the table became a challenge. The humiliation they wanted to feed her, she transformed it into focus, into fire. Then something shifted. Her posture changed. A small movement, but powerful enough for people to notice. She placed the paper down on the table, straightened it, and stared at it with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The billionaire's grin faltered. For the first time that evening, doubt flickered behind his polished composure. He tried to reclaim control with another burst of laughter, but it landed flat. The energy had changed. The crowd that once cheered him on now leaned toward her. Curiosity had replaced mockery. What was she doing? How could a waitress look so unshaken in front of a man who owned half the room? She reached for a pen that wasn't hers, left behind by one of the guests. The action was slow, deliberate, sovereign. As she leaned closer to the page, her reflection shimmered in the polished surface of the table, a woman no one had truly seen until now. Then the pen moved. Her hand flowed across the paper with precision and grace. Lines connected, symbols balanced. Every stroke carried history, nights of studying by candlelight, tears of frustration when tuition was too high, the echo of a mother's voice telling her not to give up. And with every number, every mark, she was rewriting more than an equation. She was rewriting her place in the world. The room fell into a silence so profound that even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. The billionaire's eyes widened slightly, his mockery freezing mid-expression. He watched, unable to stop what he had started. She was solving it. Quickly, effortlessly, beautifully. Her mind danced through layers of complexity he couldn't follow. Where he saw confusion, she saw rhythm. Where he saw chaos, she saw harmony. The same arrogance that once made him believe he was untouchable now made him blind to the truth unfolding in front of him. When she finished, she placed the pen down softly. No triumph, no dramatics. Just quiet finality. For a moment, no one moved. The paper lay between them, the proof of her brilliance, the end of his superiority. She stepped back, her face calm, her eyes clear. The billionaire looked down at the equations, confusion creeping into his features. He recognized the answer. It was right, flawless, something even his analysts had struggled to perfect. And for the first time, he didn't know how to react. Laughter had been his armor, but now, silence became his prison. The guests looked from him to her, realization spreading like fire through the room. The same people who had chuckled seconds ago now felt the sting of shame. They weren't watching a waitress. They were witnessing brilliance that had been buried beneath servitude. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She simply walked away, her steps steady, each one echoing louder than the billionaire's laughter ever had. But the night wasn't done with her. When she stepped into the corridor outside the dining hall, her hands finally began to tremble. The emotions she'd suppressed flooded in. Anger, exhaustion, disbelief, pride. She leaned against the wall, the paper still burning in her memory like a brand. What she had done wasn't just personal vindication. It was rebellion. Quiet, unplanned, but powerful. She had exposed something deeper than one man's arrogance. She had revealed how society builds walls of perception around race, gender, and class, walls so tall that brilliance often suffocates before it's ever seen. Inside the dining room, whispers turned into murmurs. Some laughed nervously to dismiss what they'd witnessed. Others stared at the billionaire, waiting for him to reclaim control of the narrative. But he couldn't. His jaw was tight, his pride shattered in a way no fortune could fix. For the first time in years, he wasn't the most intelligent man in the room. He had been defeated, not by another businessman or a rival tycoon, but by a woman he didn't even consider worthy of acknowledgement. Outside, she took one final look back through the glass doors. The chandeliers reflected her face faintly in the distance. For the first time, she saw herself not as invisible, but as undeniable. And somewhere deep inside, a decision began to form. She would never again let her worth be dictated by where she stood or what she wore. The test he had created to humiliate her had become her resurrection. Was more than a solved equation. It was justice in numbers, redemption written in ink. That night, something in her shifted forever. She returned to the small apartment later than usual, her daughter asleep, her old notebook still open on the table. For the first time in years, she added something new to it, a fresh page filled with clean, confident handwriting. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone anymore. But she had rediscovered something priceless, the belief that she still could. The world had seen a waitress solve what was meant to break her. She saw a woman reclaiming the life that was once stolen from her, and though the billionaire's world would spin on, that night would haunt him. Not because of the mistake he made, but because of the truth it exposed, that the worth of a human being can never be measured in wealth, titles, or privilege, only in the courage to rise when the world expects you to kneel. Silence. The kind that feels alive, breathing, pulsing, judging. Inside the grand restaurant, no one moved. The billionaire's laughter, once the loudest sound in the room, had died an awkward, brittle death. It hung there unfinished like a broken note that refused to fade. His guests, the ones who once mirrored his arrogance with obedient laughter, now sat frozen, caught between disbelief and guilt. The paper lay in front of him, its edges curling slightly under the weight of the room's heat. A few faint ink smudges marked the places where her fingers had gripped it, steady, unflinching, alive with quiet defiance. The symbols, perfectly solved, stared back at him with an irony he couldn't escape. The numbers didn't lie. The truth was undeniable. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't have control. The billionaire's world had always been built on applause, on power, dominance, and the illusion that money equaled brilliance. But now the illusion had cracked, and standing amidst the fragments was the truth he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Intelligence wears many faces, and humility was the one he had never recognized. His hand twitched toward the paper again, as if touching it could rewrite what had just happened. But it couldn't. The ink was dry, and so was the mask he had worn for years. Around him, people shifted uncomfortably. The air was too thick with shame to breathe. Someone coughed softly. A small, human sound in a space that had always celebrated perfection. It broke the tension just enough for everyone to realize what they were witnessing wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was a reckoning. She stood at the far end of the room now, near the exit. Her back was straight, her breathing calm. She didn't need to look at him to know what was happening. The silence was enough. She could feel it wrapping around him like a mirror he could no longer avoid. In her chest, her heart beat with a strange rhythm. Not triumph, not vengeance. Something purer. A quiet peace that comes when dignity returns to its rightful place. She had lived her life in the shadows of people like him. Men who mistook politeness for submission, humility for weakness. But tonight, the shadows had shifted. The billionaire looked up finally. His eyes met hers across the room. And in that moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. He saw her not as a waitress, not as background noise in his performance, but as a reflection of everything he had lost in his pursuit of power, integrity, grace, humanity. Her stillness was louder than his empire. Her silence was heavier than his wealth. The guests followed his gaze. Their own shame deepened. In her presence, every smirk they had shared moments ago now felt poisonous. Every chuckle burned their throats. No words were spoken. But something unspoken passed between them all, a recognition that they had witnessed something raw and rare. A person reclaiming her worth in a world that had stolen it. She turned toward the exit. The soft sound of her shoes against the marble floor echoed in the silence, rhythmic and haunting. Each step she took seemed to erase a piece of the room's arrogance. By the time she reached the door, the billionaire's empire of laughter had completely collapsed into a graveyard of whispers. But she didn't stop. She didn't turn around. There was nothing left to prove. Outside, the night air met her like freedom. It was cool, quiet, alive with the hum of the city. A city that didn't know it had just witnessed a revolution in a dining hall. She stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up. Between the tall buildings, the sky was fractured into narrow strips of darkness, sprinkled with faint stars. She exhaled, the kind of breath that feels like letting go of years of weight. Inside, the billionaire remained still. The laughter that had once defined him now mocked him in his own mind. He could still see her face, calm, composed, untouched by the cruelty he'd meant to inflict. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be small, not in wealth, but in soul. He tried to reason it away, to convince himself it was just luck, coincidence, performance. But deep down, he knew better. Her brilliance had been effortless, unpretentious, real. His had been borrowed, inflated, hollow. The realization burned more than humiliation. It exposed the truth he had buried for years, that arrogance is not confidence. It's fear wearing a crown. He had built his empire to be admired. But admiration without respect is emptiness disguised as success. In that dimly lit restaurant, surrounded by wealth and silence, he finally saw what he had never allowed himself to see. Her humanity, and his own absence of it. He glanced again at the paper. It wasn't just solved, it was corrected. She hadn't only completed his challenge, she had refined it, improved it, transcended it. It wasn't just intelligence that humbled him that night. It was grace, and that was something he couldn't buy, couldn't learn, couldn't fake. As he sat there, staring at the equations, his own reflection blurred in the wine glass before him. For the first time in years, he saw not the image he projected to the world, but the man he truly was. And the sight made his chest tighten with something he didn't recognize at first. Regret. True power, he realized, isn't in owning more. It's in being more. And he wasn't. The moment was small, intimate, invisible to the world outside. But inside that grand dining hall, something divine had shifted, a fragile, necessary exchange between humiliation and awakening. The billionaire lowered his head. No applause followed. No words were exchanged. But the silence that filled the room spoke volumes. It was the kind of silence that changes people, the kind that lingers long after the moment ends. Outside, she continued walking, her steps steady, her head high. The cool night breeze caught her hair, carrying it like a banner of quiet victory. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply walked forward into a life that, for the first time in years, felt like her own again. Somewhere behind her, inside that glittering hall of pride, a man finally learned the difference between genius and wisdom. And somewhere deep within himself, he whispered a truth he had never said aloud. He had met someone extraordinary. And in trying to humiliate her, he had been humbled instead. The next morning, the city woke like it always did. Horns blaring, streets humming, people rushing through lives that didn't leave room for miracles. But somewhere in that endless rhythm, two lives had quietly changed forever. For her, it began with the sun. It spilled through her thin curtains, bathing her small apartment in gold. The light felt different that day. Not softer, not warmer, but real. It touched her face as if the universe itself had come to acknowledge her. She stood in front of the mirror, her apron hanging by the door, her uniform folded neatly on the chair. The same clothes, the same world, but not the same woman. The reflection staring back wasn't tired or defeated anymore. There was something new in her eyes. Not pride, not arrogance, but recognition. Recognition of her own worth, of a truth that had always been there, waiting to be remembered. She made coffee slowly, savoring the sound of it dripping into the cup. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing anywhere. The clock still ticked, but it no longer owned her. On the table beside her sat the old notebook, the one that had followed her through years of struggle. Its pages were frayed, but its spirit wasn't. Last night she had filled it again. Lines of logic, equations, thoughts, all flowing like a river finally freed of its dam. What had happened in that restaurant wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was a reawakening. She realized something profound. The world doesn't hand you dignity. It tries to take it from you until you decide to stop giving it away. And she had stopped. Her daughter's soft footsteps interrupted her thoughts. A small voice called from the hallway, sleepy and innocent. She turned, smiling, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. She had done it for her. Every long night, every compromise, every tear swallowed in silence. But last night something changed. Her daughter wouldn't just inherit her struggle. She'd inherit her strength. Later that day, she walked the same streets as always, but they felt different under her feet. The same stores, the same faces, the same rhythm of life, yet she carried herself with a calm defiance that turned heads without meaning to. She passed by a newspaper stand. The morning's headline didn't mention her. The world hadn't noticed what had happened. But that didn't matter. True change rarely begins with headlines. It begins in silence, in unseen revolutions of the heart. She went back to work, not out of need, but out of principle. The restaurant glowed as it always did, pristine, arrogant, a temple to money and taste. Yet as she stepped inside, the air shifted slightly. Conversations dipped. Eyes followed her, not out of scorn, but curiosity. Word had spread. Whispers had traveled faster than truth usually does. The story of a waitress who had humbled a billionaire was now a quiet legend among the staff. They didn't know the details, only that something extraordinary had happened. Something that gave them all permission to stand a little taller. She didn't seek attention. She didn't want applause. She just did her work as she always had. But now, when people looked at her, they didn't just see a uniform. They saw a woman who had faced the kind of arrogance that defines the world, and walked away undefeated. In a corner booth that afternoon, a young waiter whispered to another, "She's the one." The words traveled like ripples, soft but powerful. And though she pretended not to hear, she did. And it made her smile. Across the city, in a glass tower that pierced the clouds, the billionaire sat alone in his office. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, a kingdom built from his ambition. But the view didn't comfort him anymore. The laughter he once fed on had gone silent. His reflection in the window looked older somehow, smaller. The events of the night before replayed in his mind again and again. Her calm eyes, her steady hands, the silence that had swallowed his arrogance whole. He had faced thousands of boardrooms, lawsuits, investors, competitors. But nothing had shaken him like that moment. For the first time, he understood what respect really meant. Not fear, not admiration, not obedience. Respect was the recognition of another person's truth, unbent by wealth or power. He picked up the paper she had solved. It lay on his desk now, the ink faintly smudged where her hand had pressed it. He traced the equations with his fingers, not for the math, but for the message. Some truths, he realized, are written in numbers, others in silence. He could buy anything, except the peace she carried when she walked away. A strange thought crossed his mind then. Maybe wealth isn't what makes a person powerful. Maybe it's what they choose to do with their power that defines who they are. The realization stung. He had spent years building an empire of mirrors, all reflecting him, none revealing him. And now, for the first time, someone had shown him what he truly looked like. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, haunted not by humiliation, but by clarity. The kind that doesn't fade. He didn't call her. Didn't try to apologize. Some moments he knew shouldn't be interrupted by words. They should live as lessons. Weeks passed. The restaurant returned to its rhythm. Life went on. But for her, everything was different. Her evenings were no longer filled with exhaustion. They were filled with creation. She studied again late into the night, her notebook alive with ideas. A few months later, she enrolled in an online program for data science. She didn't announce it to anyone. She didn't need to. Every night she worked, saved, studied, one page at a time. The same patience that once kept her quiet now became her strength. Years later, she would look back on that night not as revenge, but as rebirth. The moment the world's cruelty accidentally gave her back her power. And somewhere, in another part of the city, the billionaire began funding scholarships anonymously. He never admitted why. He never mentioned her name. But every scholarship bore the same quiet inscription. For the ones who were told, they couldn't. As the story fades into memory, the narrator's voice lowers, steady, emotional, reflective, because this story was never just about a billionaire and a waitress. It was about the timeless collision between arrogance and grace. Between those who believe they own the world and those who remind it what humanity looks like. It's about the strength to stand tall when the world bows your head. About the intelligence that doesn't need an audience to shine. About the courage to stay silent. Not out of fear, but because silence sometimes speaks louder than all the noise combined. And in that silence, somewhere between injustice and redemption, a truth emerges. One the world keeps forgetting. Greatness has no color. Dignity has no price. And respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. So when you see arrogance dressed as power, remember her story. Remember that brilliance can wear an apron, that resilience can wait tables, and that humility, when tested, can break empires. Because in a world obsessed with wealth and status, sometimes the loudest awakening comes from the quietest soul, and the man who once believed he could buy everything learned that the only thing worth owning is the part of you that can never be bought.